All right. Well, as Matt said, my name is Brad Babst. I am with the Small Business Development Center here at the OSU South Centers. And today we're going to talk a little bit about business financing and, your path to getting funding for your business operation. That's one of the things we do. We work with small business owners or potential small business owners on business planning and access to capital. One of the biggest questions that a lot of people have when they're getting ready to start their business is, where can I get money at for my business? What does it take to borrow money? First question a lot of people ask, really, before they do a lot of planning is they worry about the money. Where's it going to come from and how are we going to get it? I'm here to tell you the first thing to do is to put a business plan together and figure out, how much money you do need, what that business is going to be about. Is it really a feasible business? And we'll let the money take care of itself when we get to that point. But there are some quick and easy considerations to financing. And let's see here. All right, we'll do this. But, financing, whenever you're really wanting to start a business, why do we need financing? Why do we need money? A lot of times when we start a business, we don't have all the money up front that it takes to get that business started. So we do need to access some kind of a capital, investment from somewhere. Whether that's a friend, a bank, some other institution that lends money. But really, we go out and we secure that money because we want to be able to get the business off the ground and running. A lot of times when we buy a new vehicle, we don't have the money up front to buy that vehicle, so we do financing because we want it and we need it now. We can't wait until we save up $30,000 to go buy it. So really, financing is just a means to accomplish short and long-term goals for the business, and that's why we do it. And, financing also should be a strategic tool, because we want to make a good educated guess before we do start that process of borrowing the money. And that's why we really want to thoroughly investigate the whole business operation and really make it a wise decision whenever we go out to start that loan process. And in pretty much all cases, you show me a business that just operates on cash that they have in the bank. Does anybody know of any that do that? Even the biggest companies, the most profitable companies that we see across the world, they have a whole portfolio of loans and money that they owe back to other investors to keep that business going on a daily basis. And a lot of times, even if a business is very successful and has a lot of money, they still have, a line of credit or something like that that's available to them, in a crisis situation, because, a lot of times we never know, especially in manufacturing or any kind of business where there's a lot of investment that's required, cash flow, things arise. Sometimes you do need that access to capital in the form of a loan or something. So what does constitute financing? Real estate loans, construction loans, credit lines like I mentioned before. These are all different types of financing that are available for your business to help you operate your business and get started. We see banks and they offer, overdraft protection. That's financing because if they're going to cover that, period of delinquency that we have in our account, they're financing our account to keep us, they're giving us a short-term loan. Usually there's a little steep fee that's associated with it if that happens, but that's financing. Credit cards are a means of financing. We've seen a lot of people that, if you're really diligent with your credit cards and pay them off on a monthly basis and you can pay the entire amount and you don't, get charged for the interest, those can be a good way to finance some of your business operations. If you know your billing cycle on your credit card, how many have played that game? If I buy this today, truly I've got about 60 days to pay for it. Because if it's early in the billing cycle, I'm not going to get that bill until, a month later. And then I've got, almost a month to pay for it. So we can get some short-term financing, at least a good 45 days on some major purchases with a credit card for a business. But again, key make sure you pay that balance off, because, you know, if you get hit with that 24% interest payment, you've just lost anything you've gained right there on that purchase. Financing can be trade accounts with suppliers. You know, if you're going into aquaculture and you buy a ton of fish food, you know, for your fish, you know, how many days is it going to take for you to pay that? I mean, do you go and write them a check? Or if you're doing that on a monthly basis, is that supplier going to extend you credit where, you know, you just go pick up the product at the end of the month? You know, you've got an account set up with them, they'll bill you at the end of the month, and then you've got so many days to pay for it. So again, it's just kind of like the credit cards, but you're going to have so many days that they're going to cover that bill for you. So that's another financing opportunity. And, you know, obviously if you go back to the credit card, sometimes you can, you know, gain a little bit of interest or rewards points or something that you can convert to cash and kind of strategically use those to even gain a little bit of an advantage by using credit cards. So that's something to definitely keep in mind. And another type of financing are non-traditional sources, private individuals, investors. You know, somebody that's willing to help you out with your business operation, kind of lend you that little bit of money to get started. So there's lots of different options there for financing for your business. So, you know, we mentioned, you know, the number one source of financing is banks. You know, that's what we've seen in the past. That's where the money is. You know, that's what banks are in business for. You know, they're really not there to hold our money and pay us a little bit of interest on it. You know, the main purpose of a bank is a business, and that is to make money, and they make their money through making loans. That's where their, you know, that's where their income comes from. You know, they want our money to invest in savings accounts or whatever, but once it's there, you know, they're really kind of taking that money of ours as an asset and then lending against that money. So that's how they're able to make loans, is by our money that's in the bank. So, you know, when we think about a banker or a lender, and we think about some of the positive signs of them and things that, you know, we see in them that lets us know that they really care about what we're wanting to do when we go for a loan, you know, they're going to listen to what we want to do. You know, if we've put together a business plan, you know, they're not just accepting it as a requirement or a checklist for, you know, something they've got to have for their loan package, but they want to hear from us directly. And developing that connection with a banker is really key. You know, if you've already got a personal banker or somebody at the bank that you do business with and you need a loan for your business, you know, don't go to the bank across the street because you've heard they're better for business loans. Go and utilize those personal connections that you already have. That's the best way. You know, a lot of times, you know, banks, you know, they make their loans based on personal connections, so you got to utilize those. The third one down there, they can customize solutions to fit your needs. And that's something too. You know, a lot of times banks, they don't make loans that just kind of fit into a XYZ pattern. Sometimes there's different banks that can do something that's a little bit different. Sometimes they can do a little bit of flexible payments, you know, up front to kind of help you get started with your needs. There's different ways that loans can be structured for your business. So keep that in mind, that nothing's really just kind of set in stone. There's a lot of options that are available. And then building that relationship with a banker, that's key to being able to access some of those more non-traditional lending methods. And the last one there, you know, they're willing to help the clients understand what they need to do to get to the next level. You know, that's where, you know, those bankers make loans every day. I mean, and this might be your first time going in for a business loan, but, you know, they've probably got a portfolio of 100 different loans that they're currently managing. So they've seen the ups and downs. They've experienced all the different things that are possible within lending. They've seen all the good. They've seen all the bad. So, you know, kind of use them as a good, reliable source to guide you as well. So we've talked about the banker. Now what makes a good customer? So you as the borrower going in, you know, what earns you favor in that lender's eyes? Number one, honesty. That's the first thing. If they catch you telling something, they know about you financially. They can run your credit. If they ask you, what bills you owe or what debts you have out there, and you tell them something because you don't want to share about that, foreclosure that you had 5 years ago, or you don't want to tell them that you're a month late on your credit card payments. They already know that. They have access to that information. So the best thing that you can do is to just go in there and tell them everything up front. Be totally honest with them about what's there in your credit history. That's going to gain you a lot of favor in their eyes, and sometimes there's some things that show up on our credit history, such as, I've worked with a lot of different individuals who have had, medical payments. They've gone to the hospital, they've had an illness in the family. How insurance companies are with health insurance, and then the hospital's billing, and they just continually bill, and first thing they want to do is turn you over to collections, and you're like, well, I know the insurance company should pay this, and you're disputing it, and they're turning you over to collections, and sometimes, we're pretty prideful. We'll say, no, by golly, that insurance company should cover that $50, and I'm not paying it just to prove a point. Well, you know what that does to you in the long run? If even though it's just $50 and you don't owe it, that insurance company should pay it, and they turn you over to collections, and you're steadfast. You're not going to pay that money. You're going to show them. You're going to stick it to them. Well, every month that's dinging your credit score. And in the long run, when you go to borrow money and you go to buy a new vehicle or whatever, your credit score determines a lot of time the interest rate that you pay on a loan. So you might have just said, I'm not paying that $50, but all of a sudden you just got pushed into another credit score category with your loan package that's going to cost you, $1,000 more in interest over the next 5 years. I mean, it's just as simple as that. So some of those small things like that, it's important to clean up or explain to a lender, hey, I know there's, some delinquencies on there from medical bills. We're working to resolve those. It's in process. We're trying to get them cleaned up. So again, being honest and providing the accurate information. And again, that little thing covered most of that right there. But good credit history. Honestly, if you have a credit card, make sure that you at least send in the minimum monthly payment every month. Because has everybody in here always looked at their credit report online? And if you haven't lately, I would urge you to go on and do that. You can do it through Credit Karma. You can go through my annual credit report or annualcreditreport.com. It's free, it doesn't cost you anything. But if you've got some loans out there, you can see what those payments look like. They'll show up, they've color-coded them, red, green, yellow. And it kind of gives you a good idea of how, the credit bureaus view you, what banks are looking at, what they see whenever they, do an inquiry on your credit to borrow money. So it's good if you kind of understand that, and it kind of helps you prepare for the future and kind of guide you in your financial pathway going forward. It makes you a better potential customer for the bank, better to get a loan. So when we look at borrowing money, and we talked a little bit about credit there a little bit ago, we call these kind of the 5 C's of lending: capital, conditions, character, collateral, and capacity. So those really are the 5 different C's that are taken into account whenever you go to borrow money. First one's capital. It's pretty simple. That's, you as the borrower, that's your net worth. How much money you're putting into the project and the risk you're taking. A plan B as far as repayments. What is your plan if the business doesn't make enough money, it's not profitable enough in the beginning to make the loan payments? How are you going to cover that loan payment? Is it going to just be from your own personal account, from your personal income, from your spouse's personal income? Do you have somebody else that's, a relative that's willing to be able to be there and, help you make those payments until the business gets going. Having all those things, kind of planned out ahead of time is key. Can you afford to make it out of your personal account? That's one thing that's there as well. Do you have the money in your banking account to, let's say, help cash flow the business for the first 3 months of operation when you really just have expenses before you start selling any product? The next one is the conditions. Where are you located? Is it a good location for your business? Are you located near, an urban area? With aquaculture, if you're looking at raising fish and selling them for food, if I set up a fish stand right out here, along the street, how many customers am I going to have? Versus if I were in Columbus and I could go downtown to a farmer's market and sell my fresh fish at that farmer's market, how many customers do I have now? So your location and your local economic climate is really important to consider as a part of that business. Obviously we've got a lot bigger customer base in some of the metro areas than we do in the rural areas. Other industries, the purpose of the loan, political influences. What's been in the news over the past couple weeks? Yeah. Tariffs, trade wars, exactly. I work here for the university, but I also farm. I've gotten out of it in the last year, and maybe that's a good thing, but I used to raise about 300 acres of soybeans. Yeah, good thing I got out, right? I'm kind of feeling that way right now. We talked about all these tariffs on, crops, and soybeans is one of the big things that we export to China. So, how's that going to impact it? We talk about, let's say, $10 per bushel soybeans, and, you talk to a lot of the soybean farmers, really, they're looking to make about a 5% profit margin on that crop. So, $10 per bushel, that's 50 cents per bushel. Whenever they started talking about this trade war and putting the tariffs on the soybeans, that day the market reacted, was down 35 cents a bushel, just like that. So where does that leave me, with my profit margin of 50 cents, and they just took 35 of it? So it's really a major hit. So that's, probably 2/3 of your profit that you're going to get for the year just by one political act that kind of drives the market. So yes, political influences can impact your business, that's for sure. And also competition. If everybody in this room went into fish farming and tried to sell your product in the same area, what would happen? Probably not be good, would it? You'd all be cutting prices to try to drive it down because you've already invested all your money in the product. So, but, being spread out over a large area, kind of helps mitigate some of those different things. So, knowing the competition that's in the area is key as well. Character, very important. Your personal credit history is a big thing that lenders look at. They want to see, how you're going to react. And like I said, they're going to look back over your credit over the past 5 years and see that you've made those payments. And, if they've noticed that, 2 to 3 times a year that you've been late on your bills, guess what they expect going forward? You're probably going to be late 2 to 3 times a year going forward. And even if with a loan, that's a bigger financial burden. So they might even expect that to be a greater concern in the future going forward. Collateral, that's a big thing that they're going to look at when you're lending. It's another C word. That's kind of the plan C. We've talked about other financing sources, somebody else to help pay the bills. But collateral, that's whenever the bank comes out and says, well, we gave you the money as a part of your loan to buy this system. Well, now we're taking it back and we're going to try to resell it to get our money back out of it. And, obviously that's not going to cover, if you buy a $10,000 system for your fish, and then 6 months later you try to resell it, how much money are you going to get out of it? Probably not $10,000. Probably not $5,000. They're probably going to sell that for $2,000 to $3,000 if it's a good day and if they've got a good market for it. So, it's just like buying a brand new vehicle and driving it off the parking lot. It's sad how fast it depreciates. And, some of, but there's a good market for, reselling automobiles. We talk about some of these specialty types of industries. There's not a huge demand out there in the marketplace for some of this equipment as far as resale goes. So, it really gets discounted quickly. So definitely something to keep in mind. This is some more information about the collateral. We talked about this a minute ago. Down there at the bottom, discounted values for businesses. Inventory, it's going to get discounted 40 to 50%. Equipment, it's going to get discounted 50 to 75%. It's just kind of the example we used with the tanks and the recirculating systems. Real estate, that's one thing that does hold its value pretty good. Land, buildings, permanent structures, things like that. Those are things that, we can kind of be assured that, as a banker, whenever they look at you lending, it's easier for them to lend you money for real estate than it is for equipment and inventory situations. That's for sure. And again, some of that's limited just because of what it is. And also the last one of the 5 major C's that we have to consider is the capacity. What is your repayment ability, as a borrower? Cash flow, that's another one. A number one thing. That's one of the things that whenever I work with an individual that's looking to go into business, as part of that business planning process is we sit down, usually first and look at the cash flow. What are the expected incomes from the business? What are the expected expenses? And what does that look like on a monthly basis? How's that money going to flow through that business account? Kind of gives you an idea of the volume of sales that you have to pay the bills, to make ends meet. So that's one exercise that's really critical before anybody starts any kind of a business, is to go through a cash flow simulation worksheet and really understand it. Because, that really sets the narrative for your whole business plan. It really says, we know that we need to, if we're selling this product, we need to sell X amount of it at a certain price, and that's going to generate this much revenue. The whole plan is based on that, and that's going to cover all of our expenses. So capacity, very key. So these are just some common sense things, questions to ask yourself, whenever you go to borrow money and get a loan from the bank. What's the purpose of the project? And then the next one, key. A lot of folks come to me and they say, we need help getting a loan for a certain project. Well, how much money do you need? They say, we'd like to get about $100,000. I'm like, okay, well, you need $100,000. What do you need it for? Well, we think that's a good amount. We've probably only come up with about $50,000 worth of stuff that we need to do the project. But, we'll probably just go ahead and get $100,000 just to make sure things are covered. Well, what things are covered? You willing to pay interest on all that money for the next 10 years or 15 years? Is that your plan? But again, it's needs and not wants. So it's really key. So if you go to the bank to borrow money, they're going to ask for an itemized list of the uses of the funds that you're securing for the business project. So, that's where you're going to need estimates for equipment, estimates for buildings, insurance, all those different things need to be listed out on a sheet and totaled up, and that should be very close to your loan amount. So it really all needs to be accounted for, and that's what they want to see. What collateral is available? How much cash are you going to be able to put in the deal? A lot of times they want to know how much money you're bringing to the table. If you're going to borrow money from a bank, you better have some cash. You better have, at least probably 20% of that money available in your savings. Because, that, again, we talked about that gap of, purchasing real estate You know, if you pay $100,000 for it, you know, it's going to get devalued to $75,000. What's making up that difference? That helps that bank feel that they're going to be able to make up the difference, that you're willing to do that. It's called, a lot of times it's called skin in the game. You know, a lot of times I'll talk to folks and they'll come in and say, well, we need to borrow money. I'm like, well, are you willing to put up your house to borrow this money for this business project? And they're like, oh no, we're not putting our house up. Well, what do you think your chances are of getting a loan if you're taking that kind of an attitude about the business? Sounds like you're not real confident in the business to me. I mean, that's kind of my take on it. And I can guarantee you what that lender's take is on that statement. Why should we give you our money if you're not putting up your house? So you're not going to get a loan if you're really not willing to put up some of your own financial, personal assets for the project. And again, the terms of the loan, what rate, what interest rate are you going to pay? How long is this project going to be financed for? And, you know, what is that estimated payment? And how's that going to fit into the cash flow? How's it going to make it work? Credit checks. You know, that's the first thing, like I mentioned earlier, the bank's going to come in and do. They're going to want to run your personal credit, see where you're at. You know, hard inquiries, you know, those count on your credit score. Every time you have a hard inquiry, it pulls your score down. And if you've gone to a bunch of different places and tried to borrow money and you get denied and you keep going to more places and trying to borrow money, all those hard inquiries are going to continually just hit your credit score and drive it down. So you've almost got to be strategic about some of these things. Whenever they look at that credit check, they're going to see, you know, balances on open accounts. Again, your payment history, maxed out credit lines, and they're going to look at your debt that you currently have personally, and they're going to look at your income. So they're going to see those different things, and they're going to measure you based on that. Again, consumer credits, you know, credit history, your employment history. Whenever you go to borrow money, even if it's to buy a car, you know, one of the first things they ask is, you know, where do you work? How much do you make? How long have you been there? Do you own or rent your home? And, you know, what's your payment on that? Those are all things that are a big part of credit. No matter whether it's a personal loan or a business loan, it's all the same. And that's really everything that's tied to you and what you look like as a potential customer. Commercial credit, very similar again. It's going to look at the business's credit, the business's activity, the structure of the business. They're going to look at the seasonality of the business. You know, with aquaculture, are you going to be able to sell fish every month of the year, year-round? Probably not. You know, depending on what you're raising, you're going to have peaks and valleys. You're going to have times where you're selling all your product at once, and you may not have any more sales again for 6 months. It's just the trend of agricultural-related businesses. You know, I mentioned the soybeans. You know, cash flowing, that whole operation. You pay for all of your investments in the spring. So then you ride that out through the summer, and you hope it rains at the right times and doesn't rain too much at the wrong times. And then in the fall, hopefully the weather's good and you can harvest your crop, and then you sell it. Well, you've got a huge investment. Like I said, we're looking at profit margins of, you know, 5% or maybe 10%. You know, you've got to fund that project throughout the whole year. So, you know, that's one of the things we're looking at with all that, seasonality and cash flow. Things that the lenders want to see out of you as a borrower. You know, again, I mentioned that, you know, at least 20% down payment. Sometimes as much as 25%. And sometimes with ventures, you know, that are riskier, you know, they're going to be up, you know, higher to 35%. Again, we talked about that collateral, that depreciation of that equipment that you've purchased with that business, how it's going to devalue very fast with some of these specialized projects. So that's where they're going to need a higher, you know, investment from you as the owner. Sometimes there's loans out there through the Small Business Administration where, you know, you can get a little bit better terms, maybe a little less, you know, investment required from you as the owner, where they're backed a little bit more by some of these government programs. But again, you know, they're going to need, you know, a cash down payment and they want to see, a lot of the times is that as, prove that you didn't borrow that from somewhere else. Prove that came from your savings or your checking account. A lot of times, again, other assets that you're going to be able to put up as collateral that they're going to be able to attach. They like real estate. So again, I mentioned your house or your home. A lot of times you go to borrow money for a business, they're going to want to see, real property attached as a collateral piece. Other things that are going to make your lender happy, again, putting up your house. Again, I can't stress that enough. I mean, that comes up all the time. People don't want to do that, but that's just, maybe you've got some other assets that you can attach. Good credit score. Right now they're looking at, right around 720 in general, most cases. Your credit score is going to need to be better than 720 for a loan. Obviously, the higher it is, the more likelihood you are of getting a loan. And if you fall below that 720, I'll just be honest, it's going to be really hard to get a loan. Really hard to get a loan. They want to see profit on the tax return too. I mean, if you're looking at a business that's going for more financing, they want to see that you're actually turning the corner and it being able to generate some revenues and profitability for the business. And they also want to see that you have access to working capital. So that's money that's going to fund your daily operations. How are you making that happen? They want to make sure that's there. Obviously, we talked about the collateral, making sure that's, sufficient. They want to see your equity be greater than your liabilities. A lot of times we talk about that as net worth. So your equity is your assets. That's everything that you own. Could be money in the bank. It could be properties, equipment. The numerical value of all of those things added together, and you subtract what you owe money for. Depends on whatever that is, whether it's a loan, whether it's your house. We just want to make sure that that equity is greater than the liabilities. They want to see that you also have done your homework as far as insurance. Are you covered with all that? Obviously, if you've done a business plan, they want to see that information. If you filed a legal structure for your business, a limited liability company is something that a lot of folks do right now. So they're easy to put together, but it also kind of shows, the operations of the business. It kind of sets that apart. It's important to have that in there, especially if you're in a partnership agreement with somebody, or if you're going into business with somebody else, even though it might be a relative. It's important to have some of those legal things in writing, because things happen. Divorces happen, family feuds happen. Make sure all of that stuff is spelled out in writing and filed away, within the articles of incorporation of an LLC or some other legal structure. That way, if push comes to shove and we need to make a determination of ownership or financial responsibility on this business, we have a document that has been filed with the state that we can revert back to prove who's responsible for what. So very important to do that. Some other things, obviously take into consideration, taxes. I'll just mention that real quickly. Here it's almost tax season, and obviously if you've got a business, everybody's goal is to not pay taxes, right? So how does that happen? A lot of times, sometimes, we can say, maybe sell some stuff for cash sales. Don't report that. You don't want to put it out there. We don't have to pay taxes on it. Never happened, right? Just like it never happened. So at the end of the year, guess what? This business just zeroed out every year. Great, right? That's the goal. We've got some money we made, we didn't pay taxes on it. So now we go to borrow money and they look at our balance sheet and it says, looks like you didn't make any money last year. I'm like, yeah, we did. Yeah, we did. It's just not there. There's a lot of cash sales that don't show up. Prove it. So, you've just lost equity in your business because of that. banker's not going to view you favorably because of that. So you just kind of shot yourself in the foot. I've seen businesses, a lot of times people are trying to retire and sell them to somebody, you know. Looks like the business lost money every year. Well, you know, the sales are there. You know, we want $500,000 for it. It looks like it's only a $100,000 a year business. Well, how can you charge that much money? Well, there's a lot of cash sales. It's not reported. Well, and true, maybe there are. But how does that buyer know that? So how can they borrow money to do, you know, that deal when the banker looks at this business as a $100,000 business and the seller wants $100,000 or $500,000 for it? So it really makes it difficult in some of those different situations. Again, we talked about paying the taxes. Spouses' incomes, you know, a lot of times, you know, we look at co-borrowers. You know, if you have a spouse that has a good income as well, you know, both of you are really going to need to be shown on the loan application to make sure that they can count that income as part of the project. So a lot of times that's what it takes, you know, just like a co-signer or a co-borrower to make that deal happen in the bank's eyes. That makes enough collateral and enough access to capital on that project to make it work. Again, if you're going to be late on something, don't be a payment to the bank or something else that's reportable. You know, make it some kind of a, you know, a supplier that, you know, is willing to understand. They know the business a little better. Maybe you can buy an extra month off of them of time to pay for something. So, but just don't miss bank payments, and also don't miss any payroll tax payments. That can really get you in trouble and throws up a lot of red flags really quickly. And bankruptcy, yes, that is true. It's at least a 7-year problem. So it's going to show up for a long time. If you've got one of those in your past, it's going to be really difficult to borrow money until those pass off of your books. Again, all lenders are not the same. If you go to the bank to borrow money for your project, they kind of laugh at you and turn you down. You know, maybe it's they don't know enough about the industry that you're doing. Maybe you need to find another bank that knows a little bit more about, you know, an agricultural related business. So if you go to a place and you don't get funded, don't get discouraged. There's other options that are out there. Building that relationship with your lender is key. You know, making sure that, you know, every time you're in the bank, if it's your bank that you're going to borrow money from and you see them sitting in their office at the desk, just stop by and say hi. You know, if you see them out in the community, or at the store, or at a ball game, at a school, you know, just kind of continually build that relationship with them. You're definitely going to be more than likely increase your chances if you do that of getting a loan from them. So that personal connection makes it harder to say no. That's one of the things you want to do. There are some different loan programs that are out there through the state of Ohio. The Grow Now program, that might be a way to get some additional funding for your business. I mentioned the SBA has some loan programs, and there are some gap funders out there. If somebody won't lend you all the money, sometimes gap funders can come in and help make up the difference in what they won't lend you, especially for some certain industries. So, the next 2 or 3 slides, just kind of a loan package checklist of things that you will need if you go to borrow money. These are things that the bank is going to want to see. You know, you don't need to write all these down. We will make this PowerPoint available on the website. We'll get it uploaded there in the next couple days. So there is a lot of things. We've got 3 pages of those. And yes, that's very common. If anybody's ever gone in here for a business loan, you've probably seen the list that every bank and every different lending agency asks for, and it's a lot of information. But, you know, they're trying to cover all their bases. You know, that lender's job is to make a loan and get repaid for it. So, these are just some different websites that you can find some additional information on, you know, business planning and loan packages and things that might be available out there to fund projects. And I would encourage you, if you have any questions, to take a look at those. But also, if you have any questions, you can always feel free to give either myself a call, give Chris Smalley a call. I know you have both of our information. This is what we do on a daily basis. We sit down and work with individuals one-on-one, help them with their business planning, help them with their cash flows. help them make a good, sound decision about their business. And that's the key. We want to plan. Planning comes first. Just because I have $50,000 to go invest doesn't mean I go invest it without thoroughly making a good decision on whether this venture can be profitable or not. So we'd like to help you do that. Like I said, please give me or Chris a call if there's anything we can do. And unless anybody has any questions right now, we will turn it over to Hannah, and I'm sure she's going to talk about cooperatives.
Yes.
How did I know? How did I know? Thank you all for your time.
And I like to be interactive because I'm kind of boring. So step in and tell me if I'm not explaining something correctly, or if you're confused, or you just want to know more. That's also very exciting. So feel free to stop us. And part of the reason I think that Matt wants me to talk about that we're talking about co-ops today, or in ABC, is because there's an effort in the aquaculture industry in Ohio broadly to look at whether a cooperative business can help the industry, particularly help producers in the industry perhaps realize some efficiencies through collective purchasing, or realize some economies of scale or pooling advantages through marketing. And we have a steering committee that's been working on this question, the grouping of questions that goes under that since December, at least since December, very intentionally. So if you know some of those members of the committee, I will speak on their behalf right now and say that you can contact them. They're open to being contacted and answering questions about the effort and hearing your input about the effort. Matt is on the steering committee, Chris is on the steering committee, and Matt Brem is on the steering committee, Ashton Chen is on the steering committee. Who am I missing? Bruce Putnam.
What's the name from Arrow Orchard?
That's helpful.
Curtis.
Curtis. It's just Curtis. He goes by one name, like Cher, Curtis in Aquaculture. You'll find him that way. Anyway, if you do have questions about this effort, feel free to get in touch with one of us, and we will help you learn more about it. But today is kind of your introduction. So without further ado, you're here at the South Centers. You know what we do. Thank you for coming. So what is a co-op? I gave you the answer. What's a co-op? Anybody? Bueller? Working together. Okay. In what ways? Yeah.
Somewhat in a symbiotic way. One does one thing and another person does something else. You combine your operations together so that both make a profit and the work is one and cut down on costs.
Great. So there's a lot packed into that. So working together symbiotically, working in ways that people have competitive advantages, realizing some efficiencies, collaborating, right? So the working together part, when we talk about cooperatives, there are lots of definitions of cooperatives. When we talk about cooperatives, we specifically are referring to the definition that USDA puts forward, because it's probably the most concise definition of a cooperative. Some people kind of get long-winded about this. But a co-op is a form of business that is owned and controlled by the people who use it. So there are three basic parts of that. Owned is the first one. Controlled is the second. And users is the third. So user-owned, user-controlled, user-benefit. That's what a cooperative is about. That basic definition, and then the principles by which cooperatives often operate, means that they operate differently than lots of business structures that we're used to. That manifests itself in governance. It can manifest itself even in the financing pieces that Brad was talking about, right? So the financing that Brad was talking about focuses on like proprietorships or partnerships, or even like LLCs or corporate entities. Even some of this will be a little bit different because of these principles and that definition. And we can talk more about that, certainly. Cooperatives are a part of a larger movement. The first cooperative that we recognize as a part of the modern movement, but you can certainly make an argument for earlier cooperation, was founded in the mid-1840s in England, and it was a workers' society. It was industrial workers coming together to actually found a store where they could get the basic necessities they needed to live, so butter, flour, candles, and they were doing so on a basis that was democratic and that was accessible to them via the market, so that it wasn't making a huge profit off of them. So they actually outlined 12 rules that their society operated by, and today we've kind of condensed some of those and picked up others and gotten rid of some, and we typically recognize about 7 principles that the cooperative movement operates by, that co-op businesses operate by. Individual businesses may operate may prioritize one of these principles over the others. They may prioritize all 7. Just depends on kind of the nature of the business and what they're doing. The 7 principles are listed here. Voluntary and open membership. You're not going to get drafted into a co-op, right? The group that's working on the aquaculture co-op in Ohio is not going to come to you and say, you're farming fish in Ohio, you have to be a member of our co-op. At least I hope not, right? We've discussed that, right? They should not be doing that. This is voluntary, and it's open. It's non-discriminatory. Democratic member control. Some folks would argue that this is probably the hallmark of cooperatives. Most days I tend to agree with them. So cooperatives are governed, some days I change my mind. So cooperatives are governed democratically, and they are governed by the people who own the business, those user members I talked about. Oftentimes that can be farmers. The farmers who own the business are the ones who control it, and they do so by electing a board of trustees, governors, directors, and those directors make decisions on behalf of the business. But that election process, that decision-making process, is a one-member, one-vote process. So when you become a member of a co-op, often you get one vote, or your entity. If your farm becomes a member of the co-op, your farm gets one vote. And let's say Ivory and I are members of the same co-op, which actually we are. That's true. So Ivory and I probably market different amounts of product through that same co-op. So it's for instance, a livestock marketing co-op. If I market animals through the livestock marketing co-op, and so does Ivory, I could market many more animals than she does, or she could market many more than I do. And we still each get one vote. I get a vote, Ivory gets a vote, and they hold equal weight, right? That's so that control of the organization doesn't manifest in a one person or a small group of people. Right, so we want that control spread across. So if we formed a co-op right now in this room, we would all get an equal say-so. Make sense? Member economic participation. This is like the, well, duh, right? Members participate. That's not often as easy as it sounds, right? The goal is that members do business with the co-op. Ivory might sell livestock through a co-op. She has other opportunities to sell livestock, not through the co-op. But the co-op is stronger, and we can talk about why. The co-op is stronger when she sells them at the co-op. That because of the reasons that the co-op exists, economies of scale. Autonomy and independence. Co-ops are their own organizations. They make their decisions, even if they're partnering with other organizations or have joint ventures. Education, training, and information. Co-ops are kind of complicated, so it helps if the co-op educates its members on what it's doing and how it's doing it. So when new members get on the board, the co-op should be doing some education with them on how boards operate, right? The other piece of this is that co-ops are stronger when their members are better at what they do. So let's take the example of, anybody heard of Land O'Lakes? The butter? Yeah? Did anybody realize that that was a farmer-owned co-op? It's owned by dairy farmers, right? when Land O'Lakes markets product on behalf of those members, it's marketing all kinds of products, right? So butter, maybe they're selling some milk, maybe they're selling some ingredients for ice cream, all of that kind of stuff. And their interest is in a high quality product, right? The business does better when their product is better. How do you get a higher quality product? What's that?
Educate.
Educate, right? Your farmers are better at what they do because that raw product is coming from them. So it makes sense for Land O'Lakes to help their farmers be better at what they do so that then the business as an entirety is better at what it does, which is market the product of those members. Cooperation among cooperatives. We like working together, right? How many people like working in a group? Really? That's way more than is typical, right? I'll be honest, sometimes I don't like working in a group. But in the cooperative space, that's what this is about. It's about working together. So often you'll see co-ops doing things together that are mutually beneficial. Concern for community, co-ops are owned again by the users. Oftentimes that's within a specific community, and so the co-op is owned by people and governed by people who inherently have a concern for that community. So you'll often see lots of co-ops having community programs or somehow being involved in the community, maybe offering scholarships, that kind of thing. Questions about any of this? Yeah.
So I know that we're from all over Ohio. How would you affect specific communities with a co-op?
So the community can be defined broadly. So there are co-ops who operate across the globe, right? There are co-ops who are global doing business. There are co-ops who are within a county, right? We have worked with co-ops who have defined their membership as a single county. So you can have everything in between, right? And that community is defined by the people who are starting the co-op. And then the engagement in that community kind of comes from that.
I think, when you think of community, are you thinking geographic community?
Yeah.
I think what they're really saying here is community are those things like farmers are the community.
Sure.
Not the geographic, it's the dairy farmers that make the community.
That makes more sense.
Right, yeah. So you can define it really pretty openly, however it makes sense for the co-op. Great addition, thank you. So when we're looking at cooperatives as a business model, as an entity structure, in comparison to these other structures, so Brad was talking about that when you start a business, you need to be thinking really intentionally about how that business is operating, right? So when you go to a lender, they're going to ask you, well, what is the business incorporated? Right? They're going to say, if it is incorporated, how is it incorporated? These are some of those options. There are 8 of those in Ohio. Have you guys done a session where like a legal specialist comes to talk or anything like that? I don't remember if that's a part. It might be. Don't revolt if it's not, though. Just make a suggestion, a very nicely worded suggestion. So you can have your business can be a sole proprietorship, a partnership, an LLC, a corporation, and a co-op, and some other ones if we get broad. But the way that these major tenets of business work can vary according to that type. So ownership, we've talked about that. In a co-op, it's user members. What about in a corporation, like a publicly traded investor-owned firm? It's shareholders, right? It's the people who own the stock. And their voting is according to the number of shares that they own, right? In a partnership, it's the partners. It's those 2 folks. And their voting can be set up by the partners, but often it's according to investment. The major users. How about in all these other types of businesses? Who are the major users? How about, let's take the example of an investor-owned firm. Who's the major user of, pick one. Do they care? They probably care, then they probably could tell you in great detail who their major user is, right? They're going to look at market segments. But their business can be used by anyone, really, right? Their business is a customer. The user is a customer. And they're going to define their market segments based on the product that they're putting forward and many other factors to have as many customers as they can, right? And their goal is to serve that customer base. How about in a co-op? The major users are members. The people who own the business are the major users. So in a co-op, when the business is thinking about its functions and how it operates, that's the population it's thinking about serving, right? So the co-op's making decisions based on what's best for that population of user members. That's a little different. Yeah?
I think I have a little problem with this because in my experience working with co-ops is that the marginal, and I've been a member of an agricultural co-op, the marginal benefit you get from the co-op compared to what you get from your business is very small.
So are you talking...
Added to you as a person monetarily through the co-op is small.
What type of are we looking at, like a consumer co-op?
Yeah.
Maybe like a food co-op or...
Yeah, food co-op. I mean, West co-ops, you know, I think that value added you get to be a member, I mean, there's information, you get discounts on your feed, you get discounts, you know, you might be able to enter markets because you have more cattle or something.
Sure.
Or something, but I think that, you know, it's very, to be part of a co-op doesn't preclude you being a limited liability corporation.
Oh, no.
Corporation. And so,
No.
it's like apples and oranges.
So your business individually, if you're a member of a co-op, your business will still be a separate business, right? And it will be structured however it is beneficial for it to be structured. And being a member of a co-op won't impact that structure, right? They're two separate entities. The idea...
Being a member of the co-op is on your expense side because you pay for your membership.
Right. It will be an expense because you're paying your membership. But the idea is, the goal is that there is some piece of your business that the co-op is helping you do better. And by do better, I mean either realize savings, sometimes insignificantly or sometimes significantly, depending on the industry you're operating in and what the co-op's providing and all of those factors combined. So maybe it's savings, but maybe it's even access to a market, right? So the livestock example, maybe it's just even having a market that you can access, or maybe it's having a market that you can access with less time and resource on your part. So for instance, if Ivory sells through the co-op, it's a lot less time and energy and resources on the part of her farm to sell through the co-op than it is for her to go find a customer to buy that livestock, right, to directly market it. That can be of value, right? So there are many ways that a co-op provides value. One of them is sharing profits. So the profit sharing could be marginal, but hopefully the co-op's providing some other benefit that makes up for that. Does that make sense? And it really depends on what the co-op's doing, where it's doing it, and how it's doing it. And so these are questions like when Brad was saying your business plan, to look at what's your cash flow like, what's your break even like. So those are the types of things that we encourage the businesses we're working with to look at, right? So where are you operating? What kind of savings are you going to create? Are those savings enough to justify the costs? What volumes do you need to create those savings? Those are the kinds of questions we're asking of startup co-ops. Does that make sense? But point well taken. That can happen, yeah.
So is a co-op an actual legal structure
Yes.
in Ohio?
Yes.
Are they typically, and how are they typically taxed? Are they considered, are most of them not-for-profit, or are they
No.
for-profit?
So the co-op is a legal entity. It's a structure that you can choose in Ohio. When you go to the Secretary of State's website, it's one of the options. The taxation is going to depend on what you're doing, but you can be a for-profit or a not-for-profit co-op. that gets a little more detailed than that. Like in Ohio, yes, it can be for-profit or not-for-profit. There are some nuances around all of that. It is taxed. The business does pay taxes. It pays taxes like every other business. The way that it pays taxes on income can be different because it's a pass-through entity. So it's going to take part of its profits right here and share them with members. So who pays tax depends on some of that. Kind of like a corporate dividend, right? Who pays the tax? Well, the corporation pays the tax and the shareholder pays the tax. It'd be similar to a pass-through entity, right? Like an S-corp.
Okay.
The tax gets paid once in a co-op. That's the difference.
Yeah.
It either gets paid at the co-op level or the member level. And the way that dividends are paid out determines that.
So you can either pass that as a pre-tax or post-tax dividend.
Let's get into, we can talk more about the details. But yes, it can either be taxed corporate level, at the co-op level, at the individual level. But the way it's paid will make that decision.
Okay.
Other questions about the entity? Is everybody like, oh my, that's unnecessary detail, right? So here's what co-ops do in the U.S. Agricultural co-ops are tracked by USDA. USDA has a division that provides co-op services. And so you can see here that these are the sales of items by cooperatives in the U.S., so largely in grains and oil seeds, fruits and veg, fish, you see here 2%. Okay. Dairy, 8, cotton, you see here, livestock is over here, and then we have other specialty crops representing the rest of that portion. So depending on your industry sector, cooperatives can be more or less prominent. They're fairly prominent in agriculture. They represent large portions of these markets, particularly grain and dairy. They represent pretty large portions of those markets. So the basic question, and Chris is probably tired of hearing this question, is can you do something better as a group than you can on your own? And that's the question where we need to put paper and pencil together and say, at what level can you do something better together than you can on your own? So this is a quote by an ag economist that I like. Agricultural cooperation represents coordination of producers to achieve mutual vertical integration. This is what that looks like. So we have purchasing here, and if we're going through the supply chain, we're going from purchasing, we've got inputs here, we're going to the producer. The producer is creating some value here and then sending along in the supply chain to market. Very simple supply chain, right? But we're going from inputs to consumers. And what co-ops allow producers to do is to extend themselves in the supply chain back or forward, right? It's about integrating in the supply chain to one of these other levels. And then of course there are also services here. So sometimes Brad was just talking about financing. Credit can be one of those services, particularly in agriculture. How many people get their electric from a rural electric? That's a co-op, right? Credit unions, they can provide lots of different types of services. But that's what that supply chain integration is about. So marketing co-ops will aggregate their members. So in this case, we'd be talking about aquaculture producers or some other types of producers, and they would take that product and they would perform various functions on behalf of those producers to market that product. They could transport it, they could grade it, they could maybe do research to make that product better, they could bargain on behalf of their members, or they could actually sell the product. Or they could do lots of those things, right? They can do many of those. What's the benefit, or what's the potential benefit, we should say? You can extend your control of the product. You've just extended yourself in the supply chain. You can potentially realize additional margins. If you're selling a value-added product versus a raw product, perhaps you can realize the additional margins there. Maybe you can save resources, time, money, other resources, right? So, moral of that story is that Ocean Spray is a co-op. The Cranberry folks with the funny videos, or the funny commercials. And they were started, I'm gonna let you do that. Okay, Ocean Spray is a co-op, right? The Cranberry folks. They are a grower-owned business owned by about 700 growers. They aggregate the cranberries that their members grow and they turn them into value-added product. So they turn them into juice, they turn them into craisins, they turn them into those delicious snacks, the granola, craisin, yogurt things. The co-op was started by 3 cranberry growers in the Northeast who were basically trying to create a market for their product. So at this point, as a grower member of Ocean Spray, you take your raw agricultural product to Ocean Spray, and they at one of their processing facilities turn it into these value-added products, and they sell it under this branded name that has value, right? And they market it on your behalf, and then when they bring that income in from marketing, you are one of the owners with which they share profits or surplus. Make sense? That's how a marketing co-op works on the ground. Here's a purchasing co-op schematic. So producers or independent retailers come together, and the co-op on their behalf performs functions to help them get product, hopefully get product at volume that allows them to receive discounts. So maybe when co-ops get to a certain stage even as well, perhaps the co-op itself is manufacturing those products, is milling some products for them, is doing something else to the product in the manufacturing process that then it goes to the end producer or retailer member. And from that, the retailer member or producer is reducing costs or increasing the quality of the product that they're getting, or actually has access to it, right? So can get the product that they're looking for. So we talked about Land O'Lakes earlier. Land O'Lakes also has, what do cows need to survive? Food, not a trick question, right? Food. So Land O'Lakes also can serve as a supply cooperative purchasing feed for their members at a discount in bulk, and actually these days milling and manufacturing feed, right? And then it being available to their members. Make sense? So co-ops also can do one of these things, or they can do all of these things. This is a video of True Value, but we'll skip it. So purchasing co-ops you might know. The hardware folks, Ace Hardware, True Value Hardware, Best Western, lots of ag co-ops are also purchasing co-ops. Southern States, anybody ever like shopped at a Southern States, those kind of places are purchasing co-ops. Questions about those? Service co-ops. So their members can be lots of different types of people, that community that we were talking about, coming together to receive some type of service function. Maybe it's farm applications, maybe it's credit, maybe it's electricity. And then their benefit oftentimes is that they have access to that service itself. But could also be that they have access to the service affordably and at high quality. So how many of you live in a rural area? Everybody get super great internet connection? No? That's one thing that co-ops are looking at these days. It's a big topic in co-op services because that's kind of the story of rural electrification, right? Companies, investor-owned companies, it doesn't make sense financially for an investor-owned company to invest in a rural area where the population density is lower, but perhaps it does in a co-op model, right? And we'll talk about, basically in a co-op model, the profit, die-hard co-op people call it surplus because it's not actually profit. We'll still call it profit. The money that's left over after the co-op brings in money and subtracts expenses, they're bringing in money from their members, right, who are paying for services or paying for product, or they're marketing product on their behalf. When you subtract the expenses, the money that's left goes back to those same people who were doing the business that created the income in the first place. Doesn't make a lot of sense to maximize profit. because you're just going to give it back to the people you maximized it from. So that difference in business model can sometimes make a difference in access to services. Does that make sense? There's a picture of the first ever rural electric. These are some co-ops. So a lot of times in these presentations we talk about big co-ops because they're examples that you're familiar with and maybe didn't even know were co-ops. But I don't want that to give the impression that co-ops only work in the situations where they're giant, where they're huge businesses. Not necessarily the case. These are some cases of co-ops that we've worked with in the past few years that aggregate or bring together small farms to realize some efficiencies or some benefit. So I was just going to share a few of these, and then you guys can ask questions if you have them. The Southern Ohio Growers Co-op is a producer cooperative owned by people who produce pumpkins. You can see that. They came together when they were being approached by major big retailers that were saying, we need pumpkins. We'd like to buy pumpkins from Ohio, and can you sell us the pumpkins? And here's how many we need. And it was very large amounts of pumpkins that none of these growers, at least in the region where these growers are, could supply. They just literally were not producing that many pumpkins to be able to service that market. So this group came together and said, all right, maybe if we are working together, we can supply that market. Then we went through a lot of those questions. How much does it take to make sense? How do you distribute? Ivory and I thought about for like a year and a half about how you distribute pumpkins efficiently. That's a harder question than it sounds like. This co-op today is in its third season of marketing pumpkins on behalf of about 7 or 8 producer members at this point who didn't have access to the market that they're servicing right now. Right? They can't access that market on their own. If they were to access that market on their own, it'd be really difficult because first and foremost, the bargaining power that they would have is much different because they have a lot smaller quantity of product. Secondly, the risk is a lot higher. If a small farmer, if one of these farmers has a crop loss and they are servicing the account on their own and they had a crop loss, what happens to that account the year after the crop loss? It's probably no longer their account, right? In the co-op, that has happened multiple times in this co-op, and the other members have covered it. And they have continued to service the account. The spreading of that risk like that is one of the benefits that they receive by being a member of this co-op. And I hope that they would recognize that. They have talked about that. This is a group out of Preston County, West Virginia, that came together because they were servicing institutions with produce. They actually now market over 100 different kinds of produce, and they were serving schools. But those 100 different kinds of produce don't all come from one farm, because could you imagine? That's insane. But the way that schools are purchasing, the volume at which they're purchasing, the schedule on which they're purchasing, makes it a lot easier for the member farmers of this co-op to work together to plan their supply and plan their production so that they can service that market, again, in a way that's less risky to them individually, and that allows them to access the market through volume. And actually, these days, allows them to access value-added opportunities. So they're starting to add value-added produce into what they're offering schools because they can access that as a group. And then this is the Buckeye Valley Beef Co-op is a livestock producer group out of Southwest Ohio. They came together. Is anybody a livestock producer otherwise? Yeah, a couple people. So when you direct market livestock locally, meat product locally, it can be a challenge if you're working with grocers or restaurants to keep up first with the volume of product that they need, because oftentimes, so working with a restaurant, what do people like to order at restaurants if they're ordering beef? Steak, right? Is an entire beef animal a steak? No, there are only so many of those, right? So your ability to keep up with that market as a single producer is pretty tough. If you're working as a group, hopefully, it's easier because you can plan the production, and that's what this group was after, was consistency of supply such that they could service a larger market year-round. So they are planning like breeding schedules, they're planning production cycles on their farms together so that they can service a year-round market, which is harder to do as an individual producer, speaking from experience. Questions about this? So what's the advantage? Anybody? Anybody see any advantages? Hopefully, scale, right? Economies of scale. So hopefully you're reaching such a scale that you're accessing new markets, that you're realizing some efficiencies in what you're doing, that you're making more money, okay? Or you're pooling other things, like knowledge. Maybe you're pooling other resources. Hopefully also you're increasing your bargaining power and you're spreading risk. Member control is another one of these advantages, right? You're doing so in such a way that the next step in the supply chain or the step backwards in the supply chain is controlled by you. Or at least you have some say, right? It's controlled by a group, but you get to have some input into that. The primary interest of these businesses, again, is member benefit. Also another quote that I like from an ag economist, cooperatives do not replace market exchange. Right? This is fully operating within the market that already exists. They're harmonizing some of that. Right? They're pulling it together to make it work together through volume. What are the limitations? Do you guys like to share? Anybody here like to share? Anybody here like to share money? You're laughing. So it's a question that we ask people, right? Because you're about to share control and profits with a group of people. So think about the decision-making process on your operation, and then think about doing that with other people for a business operation. Sometimes people tell us it's not worth it, and that is totally acceptable and fine. Sometimes financing can be complicated. So all that stuff Brad just told you that was complicated for sole proprietorship or a business that's owned differently, it's kind of even more complicated for this. Because, so Brad was talking about like, what kind of collateral are you going to bring to the table? So what kind of personal guarantee are you going to bring to the table? If you're in a co-op that's owned by 700 farmer members, who's making a personal guarantee? The answer should be no one, right? Hopefully, that's not how that business is structured. It's not how the responsibility of that business falls. So the idea here, this is not, it's also not impossible. The idea is to work with a lender who understands that model and understands that some other way of fulfilling that collateral need needs to be worked out. It's not impossible, can happen, just needs to be worked on. Make sure your lender, if you're a co-op, understands the model, really. And we've had groups that even before, and I thought this was extremely smart, even before they incorporated, when they were just thinking about being a co-op, they brought their lender to the meetings with us with them, right? Their lender sat through all the same meetings as we did. So they really understood the model. So that can be helpful. There are also other, there are financing organizations that are organized cooperatively, particularly in agriculture. So the farm credit system, all those farm credits, those are cooperatively owned businesses, providing credit to agricultural producers and rural residents. This is complicated, right? So it can be a little more complicated than you on your farm just saying, today I'm going to harvest, and you go harvest, right? The operations of the business in a co-op are taken care of by a manager. The high-level priority setting, policy setting, hiring and firing management, financial responsibility, setting the vision and direction for the co-op, that's a board responsibility, and you have to do it together. So hopefully you like working together, right? And hopefully the board can function in a way that sometimes it's hard to work together because of various reasons, but hopefully the board can find a way to do that. Other thoughts, questions, comments?
right, so this presentation is all on a recirculating system and biofiltration, but it is certainly a 101 and an introduction. Been granted maybe 30 minutes or so to cover both. However, we know that's quite impossible, so it is a very condensed version, but part of the filtration, part of it is just more to discuss things broadly, but one of the things that, or the whole reason that this filtration really works, well, and part of it, depends on what type of filter you're looking at, but is that bio or the biological part in the beginning, which deals a lot with water quality and water chemistry, and it might be in August, but our entire day will be dedicated to that. So this is more or less kind of a real basic intro, and then of course a lot of things boot camp just kind of build on themselves throughout the rest of the year. And then of course all of this is recorded and posted online, so as you have questions, feel free to let me know. Especially when you need help filling in the gaps, because by no means is this all-encompassing. Everybody should know what a recirculating system is by now, but just a definition, just a land-based aquaculture system that recycles and reuses our water for the culture of these aquatic organisms. And then we'll assume that it's indoors for this talk, and oftentimes, as I've already mentioned, a lot of times we say aquatic organisms and not necessarily just fish, or not growing fish in the recirculating systems, because as we all know, it doesn't have to be just fish. And I do have something to pass out, but I'll wait. Since I already started, I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then the categories are fairly well defined, and of course less exchange needed means more efficient water reuse. And I will expand on that in a second. But basically, as we all know, you basically need to have the carrying capacity or push these systems to a limit as much as possible to help kind of decrease your return on investment. You know, if you have a tank, a 500-gallon tank, and you want to stock 50 fish in there, that's fine, but it's going to take you a very long time to go back and recoup your costs, because those tanks are expensive, really no matter what you're using. If it's a tank that size, the filtration that you have is expensive. The square footage that you're utilizing for that space when it could be utilized for something else is very expensive. So of course they're going to tell you that these recirculating systems really need to push to the limits. When you think about a gallon of water or a jug of milk and the amount of volume that water covers, and expect that you can push a half a pound of fish or a pound of fish for that 1 gallon of water, it seems a bit ridiculous, but that's the way these systems are designed in order to help at least bring you closer to becoming profitable. And of course, as we all know, these are, especially if they're a round system, and we'll get into all that, you know, it's not like these animals are just stuck in a legit 1 gallon jug. They're just able to swim around and things like that. And then of course what we see here, and we always preface this, but a lot of times these education or research systems are often going to be so much lower than commercial because we are trying to do replicated studies and things of that nature. We don't get into too much, but when you do get into these half pounds or 1 pound of fish per gallon of water, these animals are living on life support. There's a popular company that says, do your fish need a babysitter? And the fish has a pacifier in its mouth. Well, these guys are living on life support, and you need something there in order to monitor these systems 24/7. And even with the aquaponics system, you generally think a little bit lower density than what a true RAS is. Even Doug and Jenny, as we learned last month, they lost their fish when their power went out. Their fish were all gone, a couple thousand pounds, in less than 20 minutes. It's not getting any easier if you're doing just a true recirculating system either. So we always recommend backup generators, automatic monitoring systems, and that sort of stuff, if that's truly what you want to do. So and it may be a little hard with the lights on, but basically as we talk about the efficiency and what goes on with your systems, and we talked about if you're able to retain more of that water each day, you're of course going to be a more efficient system. And the way you become a more efficient system is have proper filtration set up to go through and clean that water. And I talk why in a little bit, but basically greater than 20% water exchange per day is very uncommon. Unless, you know, you get above 20% or so, you almost start to become, well, at least 50% or even 100% or more, but you become a flow-through system, which is what most of your I'd probably say 80 or 90% of your trout production in the United States is done, is in a flow-through system. Water comes in one side, whether it be serial reuse or not, but basically water comes in one side, goes out the other, and it's never recycled back to that farm. Most of the time that happens with areas that there is a plethora of water, and they've designated water rights to those particular farms and things of that nature. A lot of times you'll see it about 7 to 15% water exchange. That means if you've got 1,000 gallons of water, you're going to be replacing 7 to 15% of that every single day. That's why people started falling in love with aquaponics and everything else, because it's water, or rather than losing those nutrients, because you're not just dumping that water straight out. You have filtration systems in there that are often backwashed, which I'll mention a little bit more later. But basically, yes, sir?
You say water exchange, does that mean you're adding new water?
Yeah, you have to take that old water out, and that water is going to come from all of the wastes that have accumulated heavily in the filtration area. You're going to be purging that from the system, and you can do that if you have drum filters. Once again, we don't get over it too much, but if you're doing drum filters, a lot of times those are automatic, so those are spraying constantly and that water is being removed from the system. Or if you have a manual biofilter that you actually have to backwash itself, either way, all of that water is being purged and removed from that system. So it's not like someone's dropping a sump right in the fish tank and purging that water out, because there's a lot of good water there you don't want to lose. It's going to be that highly condensed, highly rich nutrient area that's generally going to be purged from that system. But we want to be as efficient as possible, because of course as we get closer to zero, that means, one, we're not wasting money on losing water. If we're a really big system, we're not worried about the EPA, because we're disposing of very, very little water, so we don't have to worry about discharge loads and things of that nature. Yes, ma'am.
Is there any numbers as to how much is lost to evaporation?
It's not going to be terrible. You're going to lose most of this to backwashing and filtering. I mean, a very small percent. I don't know what it is, but a very small percent.
I was just wondering.
Yeah. It all has to do with what species you're raising and all that sort of stuff, how good of ventilation and how good your HVAC system, and kind of repeat the question was just regarding evaporation, and especially if you're indoors, these facilities get very humid, but a lot of times there's a lot of evaporation, condensation, things of that nature. But a lot of it depends on the species you're raising, how hot does it have to be in that facility, how humid it has to be in that facility, and how good your HVAC is. And then, of course, you can do 0%, but at least on a large scale, it's very, very difficult, because think if your system was going to try to purge that 5%, you continually to break down those wastes until it's at a point that you could reintroduce it. It gets very expensive to utilize all that square footage space. System designs and considerations. This is basically pulled, it is pulled right from a SHRAC publication. I've already talked about these before, but that stands for the Southern Regional Aquaculture Center. And there is more information jam-packed in all of these extension publications than we could ever give you in 3 or 4 boot camps. There's a lot of great information there. But there is, it's not the perfect flow. So a lot of times what you generally see is basically the water leaving from the fish culture area, and it'll go through many, many different steps of filtration before it ever gets returned back to the system. It's a little bit misleading at times to see it go from here to saddleable and biological and back to the fish, and then straight from disinfection. A lot of times you'll kind of see that flow of water continually go. So you'll do disinfection a lot of times after filtration if you're going to utilize it. Of course, if you're using UV or ozone, if there's any harmful pathogens in the water, you're going to run that water through that area. Problem with things like aquaponics and stuff, it's going to kill a lot of your bacteria and that specific micrometer size, good or bad, that might be passed through that system. So they're not crazy common in aquaponics. But just gives you an idea of all the different components that are in there. Just be cautious of exactly how that flow diagram sits through there. So the 2 main concerns of our solids that we have in there are going to be our settable solids, and then those are the suspended solids. And we talk here, kind of waste removal, settable and suspended, biological, so that's more of your nitrification. Once again, we barely scratch the surface on here, and we'll talk more on the water quality section. But these are 2 very different different types of filtrations, but even within the waste removal, you have the settable and the suspended solids. Those are two completely different things going to be taken out with different mechanisms. Settable solids are those solids that once they leave the fish tank and you put it in somewhat of a stagnant body of water, within that hour period of time of it sitting there, or 20 minutes, however long your retention time is, how much of those solids settle out? We've all seen the aquaponic systems. Y'all have seen our system back there. It gives you a very clear idea, but a lot of times the same principles are going to be applied in your, or will be applied in your RES also. So those are whatever settle out in an hour. That's by far the easiest stuff and really the cheapest stuff to get rid of, right? Because if it's really heavy, it settles out. You can open a valve, purge it, and either discharge it from the system, aerate it, put it back in the system, whatever it may be. And then you have those suspended solids, so those that remain in suspension, and a lot of those are more of your micro or macro solids that are a lot harder to see with the naked eye, but those are the ones that are going to remain in suspension. They're too small, they're too light, they don't have gravity, and it's not really pulling it down to the bottom of that tank within that hour of time. So of course it's going to be a lot easier to do the settable solids first before you do the others. Regardless of whether it's our recirculating system down there or the aquaponic system, you're always going to see the settable solids go first before you do the total suspender, the stuff that's still suspended, second. And you're also going to have the biological filtration. All of that's going to come after the nitrification process. It's going to come after the settable solids, because once you break up that waste solids, it makes it very, very difficult to remove. So we're not going to do nitrification or worry about the suspended solids through a filter before we worry about the suspended or the settable solids. Two S words, but very different things. Suspended versus what settles onto the bottom. If we take that those filters that are doing nitrification, or what we're worried about with the suspended solids, and run that fish water through there first, all it's doing is banging all of that waste solids up, and it makes it a whole lot harder to remove. Basic principle stuff, but it does, if you design your system wrong, it's just going to give you a good headache. We do, and I actually didn't mention this, I've kind of melded together a couple of different presentations. Basically, your rounded tanks are going to be a lot more common. If any of you, did anybody go on the bus tour last year for ABC? Nobody? If you've been to Ripple Rock, they've got something, a different design, but for a lot of points you see your circular tanks being the most common, but you can also do any shape that you can get your hands a hold of. A lot of people use IBC totes or things of that nature. They may use cut down grain bins with HDPE liners in them, things of that nature, but a lot of times it is more of a round design. And once again, kind of pulled from something else, but a lot of people like instead utilizing these rectangular ones because you're able to fit more tanks into the same amount of square footage. It also makes it a lot easier to harvest, because if you can put a net down across on each side and have someone walk down, it's a lot easier than trying to capture the fish in a circular area. Problem is there's a lot of goods and bads that come with both. And Dr. Ebling, who I've referenced at the end of this, he makes a great quote. He's I forget what type of engineer he is. It's on the tip of my tongue, but he basically says the only thing engineers can agree on is that the fish need water to live in. After that, it's all open for interpretation. Another reason, of course, is they're not quite as efficient at self-cleaning. Just a traditional rectangular tank. You know, we're not talking yet about, as I briefly mentioned in a second, are these mixed-celled raceways that we have a facility here in Ohio that utilize. But for the most part, we look at kind of a water flow. If we do have a center drain, or if you have a Cornell drain, it might be a little bit, dual drain, it might be a little bit different. But you can kind of imagine how you might have a little bit of quiescent zones in the corner of these. In any spot that you have these solids not settle out, because you have the fish swimming in the same direction that the water flow is coming in and causing that great circular, which you're hoping pulls all the solids down towards the center. In a rectangular environment, you're going to have these kind of quiet zones where you don't necessarily have those solids being removed. Well, if those solids don't get removed and they just kind of pile on top of each other, Well, whatever's at the top of that pile is still going to have oxygen reaching to it, so you're still going to have the good bacteria breaking it down. The problem is when you get down towards the middle, if you just think of an anthill, the outside part's still exposed to the environment, but kind of the middle part is going to end up going anaerobic. Because anaerobic, you get different types of bacteria that are really messing up our system when we want all of the external filtration to be utilized and not necessarily worry about what's going on in this environment. And it just ruins your water quality and pulls down your oxygen as well. And then, of course, just some of your basic stuff, something like a self-supporting wall. If you have a circular tank, no matter which side you're pushing on, if it's full of water, it's going to kind of be self-sustaining. Whereas if you have, of course, a rectangular environment like this, you have each individual wall kind of pull on its own. And then, of course, these larger but fewer tanks, and there are a boatload of them on the internet. It might be, used to be common to do 1,000 gallons or so of a tank. It's very, very, very common to have tens of thousands of gallons of tank nowadays. I think, basically, we already talked briefly about raceways, but the mixed cell raceway design is something that does utilize that rectangular environment, but due to just the way it's engineered and designed, acts very different than a rectangular tank. It offers some of the positives that come with being able to easier harvest if you're just putting a net straight across and pull through, but also helps kind of limit any of those quiescent or those dead zones that may occur in kind of a regular rectangular tank. But we all know people are going to utilize whatever they have on hand, whatever they can get cheap, and that sort of stuff. You just understand that there are positives and negatives to everything you do. And then general water flow and RAS, these are also pulled from, I think it's the same Southern Regional Aquaculture Center publication, Track 451. And of course, it's all recorded. You find the track publication, not very hard, not worrying about you memorizing everything. But what I mostly want you to see is all the little PAL type things. Basically, it's a different type of filtration. And so what you have is your fish culture area a lot of times make it up not even just a small square footage of an environment, but also the small investment when it comes to everything else that's involved with these types of systems. And then, of course, this type of system has your dual drain or your Cornell type environment ingrained into it. Once again, we're kind of an overview, but I give this quite frequently, but part of it is why is filtration so important in your recirculating system. Well, it's because about half the feed that you add to that system is going to end up at waste solids. Those waste solids are very toxic to your aquatic animals. You've got to remove them somehow. If not, you're going to kill your fish pretty quickly. On more than one occasion, I've heard people say I've had a gallon jug that had a goldfish in there, and I fed him a couple flakes, but I never once added oxygen. I never once had a filter on it to change the water or anything of that nature. Well, the problem is as little as she's feeding and as little oxygen as the little bit of bacteria that's in there and the little amount of oxygen that little goldfish is taking up really is quite minimal. So it's able to kind of self-sustain itself. And then specifically with the oxygen, it's continually using up oxygen, as is the bacteria. But that case is just so much that you have the atmospheric air touching the water, and that little bit of diffusion oxygen is enough for that one little goldfish. The problem is when you throw 10 goldfish in there, what happens? They immediately die, which is basically what we're trying to do on a much larger scale here. So that's why we use these multiple filters to help improve efficiency size. And this is not just manual removal such as those settable solids. We just use this kind of as a reference compared to the UV sterilization or the nitrification, the biofiltration, or the moving bed bioreactor sort of stuff, all the way back to all the different types. If you kind of lump it into one, it makes sense that, and this is why we get to the taking out the suspended solids, or I'm sorry, the settable solids before the suspended solids, because if I try to put a bunch of waste solids through this area first, these guys are going to clog immediately. If they clog immediately, then that means I have to be out there 20 times a day backwashing the system and cleaning the system. When I could utilize, once these are kind of metaphors for what we're really looking at, but if I put it through here, well, all of my big heavy stuff comes out easily. Then I get a little bit finer, and I focus on different things. When we get to the very end right here, we're looking at stripping carbon dioxide out of a system. We'll talk more in the water quality section, as well as more of the UV sterilization. So those are the very minute micrometer size particles that I'm worrying about removing from the system first, or last. No point in trying to do that sort of stuff first. So at about that 25 to 50% of the feed that you add to that system, you've got to have some way to get it out. And then not just the feed, but also the ammonia that's excreted from these fish. It's all pH and temperature dependent, but that ammonia can be in a toxic form or a non-toxic form. So you're unionized or ionized, not worrying as much about ammonium ions. But that's excreted from the fish. You got to have some way to clean that up as well. And a lot of that ammonia is where you utilize those good bacteria that we hear so much about, helping with that nitrification to convert it from ammonia down into nitrates. And then I already mentioned each of these filters are going to have a specific size, and then that's where we get into more of the talking about the bacteria, talking about the nitrification or denitrification process and things of that nature. So your feed's going to affect the system by a bunch of different ways. It's going to increase the oxygen demand of the system. So it is an organic material, so as it starts to decompose, it's going to be using up oxygen, which is not good because we need all the oxygen for our bacteria and for our fish. It's going to produce those waste solids, as I mentioned a bunch of times. It has to be removed. It's going to produce that CO2 and really acidify your system. But most of those are your byproducts from those bacteria that are set up in that system. That's why a lot of people talk about adding baking soda to a recirculating system to help keep and buffer that pH. That gets into alkalinity and everything else. But basically, as you feed a pound of, and kind of the general or the rule of thumb, as they say, is about a pound of feed. A lot of people add a quarter a pound, so 25% of that amount as baking soda, because it'll actually help kind of buffer that pH, because if not, as that feed starts to break down by all of those bacteria, well, they're producing that carbon dioxide, which is going to turn it into more of an acidified system. And of course, we want a very balanced pH. We don't need strong fluctuations. We'll talk more in August about stuff like that. And you're feeding that bacteria, and of course, we're going to promote that fish growth. We'll kind of skip over this because we talk about it a lot, but we mentioned that. So if you add 2.2 pounds of feed, if you've seen this slide before, you know the reason that these numbers are so kind of ugly is because 2.2 pounds, does anybody know what that is in a kilogram? That's 1 kilogram. So the numbers look a lot nicer when you do the 1 kilogram, but nobody knows the kilos, so we'll switch it over to pounds. Basically, as you add a kilogram of feed, you're going to be using up this many pounds of oxygen, this much alkalinity. You're also going to be producing carbon dioxide, waste solids, and then that ammonia, nitrogen across the gills and things of that nature. So everything is interrelated to each other, which reverts back to the RAS general design of the system, how your filtration is set up, and it hits on what we're going to talk about this afternoon, specific with aquaponic design ratios, or at least considerations and things of that nature. So it's all kind of interrelated. You can't learn one thing without learning the other. Unfortunately, aquaculture doesn't work that way. You kind of got to be, you may not necessarily be a master of all, but you got to at least be a jack of all trades. So as I mentioned, these biofilters are actually going to, specifically where the nitrification process is occurring, it's going to use up oxygen and produce nitrite. The good thing is that if you've got a well-established system there, it's going to convert it over into stuff that's not harmful for our animals or gets purged from the system rather quickly. And then there are a boatload of filtration systems out there. Once again, that reverts back to the only thing you agree on is that you need water for the fish to live. And all these different commercial operations utilize different types of filters, and we can certainly discuss more. Part of the manufactured media utilize with some of your nitrification processes. I apologize, it is tough to see, but basically you've got a lot of different prepared materials. So these are kind of like your polyethylene or different types of plastic that are utilized. But the main part is that we need a very high surface area, because the higher the surface area that there is, the more bacteria that'll grow. The more bacteria that grow, the more efficient we can, our recirculating system is going to be designed if everything else is designed correctly as well, because you'll have more bacteria converting that ammonia over into nitrates, which is what we wanted to see. And a lot of times you look online for these various companies, you'll see a lot of stuff designed as X number of square foot, and what we're really looking at is stepping back, and it's much more than we talked about in this one class, but basically I'm wanting to produce this many pounds of fish per year. What size biofilter do I need to do? And there are specific conversions of, we expect this much ammonia to be produced, as I mentioned in the other slide, for this many pounds per day. I need to design my filters to be able to remove so much ammonia and soluble solids and suspended solids out of that system. And there are, of course, a bunch of different things, especially in aquaponics, that people use. Sand's common in an RAS also, but I've seen people use PVC shavings that are tied up in nets, coarse twines, burlap sacks, all these types of things. Basically, one of the biggest things you want to worry about or think about when you're designing either your small homegrown ones, your small hobby scale, or when you go larger, is what type of media you're going to utilize for these bacteria to grow. You want to make sure that whatever you're adding to that system isn't going to leach into the system, so it's going to affect the pH of the system or whatever else. And we can certainly talk about that more, but a lot of this sort of stuff is fairly inert. And I'm running out of time, so I'll kind of skip. I'm actually past time, but I'll go quickly through these. But there's a lot of environmental stewardship. I will tell you that a lot of aquaculture does feel like they're being pushed inside by a lot of folks, including a lot of your environmental companies. There are a lot of folks who only want a certain species, and certain species perfectly fine, but even species that might be native to an area, a lot of people want to have these systems be pushed indoors. The problem is that they're very capital intensive compared to digging a pond and throwing some fish out there and aerating it and feeding that system. But there are a lot of positives that follow on through here. You can be able to sell your wastewater if you want, super common. Less water per pound of fish, and then of course allows you to protect both the inside and the outside. Allows you to improve your control. Won't go through all of these, but there's a lot of things you can do in an indoor system that you certainly can't. And then we talk about the limited pathogens in a traditional RAS if you're utilizing super common is UV light, which is basically just a light bulb that the water passes through and sterilizes the system to help with pathogens. Certainly super positive. And then unless you get certain birds and stuff in there, it really helps limit the predation that's on that system. A lot of farmers, especially down south with these large ponds and these very large farms, they have a huge death rate specifically to predation. And of course it doesn't have to be that specifically is actually a lesser scalp that ate that bluegill, but whether it be snakes, turtles, otters, or even humans poaching on the land. There are a lot of negatives, but the biggest negatives that really come with a recirculating system really comes with the economics. And you don't have to really focus on much of this, but basically you have the vertical dotted line here, the vertical dotted line here. All this is I do it here, a 1.2 hectare pond up on top versus the same amount of fingerlings being produced in a recirculating system. It's just one little economic study, but it does kind of show you that the shift to grow these guys in a pond versus growing them in a recirculating systems for this specific study, it was about 2.5 times or 2 3/4 times more expensive to culture them in an indoor system. But that's the same species. You're going to be going after these niche markets, focusing on these higher end items, hopefully worrying about a market that's going to allow you to command a higher price and all those sorts of things, which helps you to adjust. But it is something that to keep in mind as well. Real quickly, this is just pulled from Dr. Weeks. He was the former regional aquaculture extension specialist for the Midwest who left to go work for the Global Aquaculture Alliance. But I haven't looked in a couple years, I guess, since he did this, exactly where all the stuff came from, but he's kind of looked at what's actually operational as a true farm, not just a small little hobby scale, but a true for-profit enterprise really pushing everything hard. What we basically see is a lot of things aquaculture, not to be a Debbie Downer, but a lot of folks come into it very optimistic, and then unfortunately in less than 5 years, a lot of these guys end up exiting the business and going after something else. And then why? Either poor system design, poor management. A lot of people think that the guy who's going to run the farm is more than capable enough of running that facility, and then when the rubber hits the road, you're not producing anywhere near what that system should actually be able to produce. And then, of course, it could be, which is a lot of times the biggest part, is the market selection, and you think you can sell it for this amount per pound, and you really can't. But, of course, a lot of it boils down to, can someone else do the same thing than you for cheaper? What about aquaponics? Yep, it's popular. We'll talk about it more this afternoon. The system that we talk about today, and then a lot of the systems that are out there, are going to be based on UVI, and everyone's made their own amendments to that system as we've gone through. But they do have the SHRAC 454 pub that Charlie Schultz was one of the authors on. He was here last year, a couple times actually. And then there's also a great little YouTube video that Dr. Danaher thoroughly goes over the system in video form. It's basically the extension publication and voice over PowerPoint, but did a really good job with that. That's put on by the Southern Regional Aquaculture Center, who also does the extension pubs, just a voice over PowerPoint of that facility there. Not been a lot of documented cases. Start here, as we all know, start slow and small. And then there's a bunch of online information out there. A lot of it's free. Be very, very careful. A lot of this stuff needs to come from your unbiased resources. We know there's a lot of good that comes from every Joe Schmo who's on the YouTube, but take all of those with a grain of salt and try to understand that a lot of these university ones are going to come with scientific-backed, peer-reviewed publications. Other than that, I've hit past my time. If you have questions, great. If not, we can talk at lunch or whatever else. Thank you very much.